p.m. and I call to order the April 28th, 2021 meeting of the City of Eugene Budget Committee. Welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to be here tonight, and I want to observe that everyone participating here, be they a member of our committee, a member of city staff, or a viewer at home watching live or after the fact, all of us are able to be here as a matter of privilege, and not every member of our community would be able to join these proceedings. And some of those community members who cannot join us are also the ones who will be affected the most by the budget we ultimately approve. So I ask everyone to keep that point in mind throughout our work tonight. With that said, thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the Budget Committee to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling in to one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the City of Eugene Budget Committee webpage. Our schedule tonight is to begin by hearing from our city manager, who will present this year's budget proposal to us. We will then have an opportunity for committee members to share their initial thoughts and to ask questions of staff. We will close with some housekeeping items and a brief look ahead at our next steps. So with that, I pass the torch to City Manager Mederi.
Thank you, Ty. I do think Councilor Syrette is still trying to get on. She was having trouble with the invitation, but Vicky is going to share her screen, and I'll do some of my welcome comments and not get into the meat of it until she's on here anyway. So that's good. As I said, do you want to pull that up, Vicky? Awesome. Thank you so much. So here we are again, and I just want to welcome you all and welcome you back to this budget year. I have a ton of gratitude for you. I know that you spent a lot of time kind of pouring through this book, and I know you do that year round and pay attention. And I hear from many of you throughout the year on different issues. So I know you're a super engaged group. So a lot of gratitude to you as budget committee members. Mayor and City Council that are here. I know you've already had one late night this week. We wrapped up at almost 11 o'clock at Monday, so I'm really grateful you're here. I want to thank the executive team who are all here. I've invited them, if they want to have their cameras on, they can, but I have also said, as long as you're paying attention and you're here, if there's questions, feel free to be camera off. They've been on late nights too. Our finance team is here, and I want to thank them. And I want to give a special shout out to all of the department budget managers that are either here as panelists or they're as attendees. I know they have put in a lot of time and work on trying to get all of this together in an especially crazy year. So with that, I just want to say thank you. I still have a sense of humor. I had this card sent to me earlier this year, and I thought it was appropriate for tonight. You might not be able to read the small print under "I'm here to help you build a new one," but it says, "I'll bring the snacks." So with that, we can go to the next slide. I believe that last year when we were doing this presentation, we had shown a photo of the riverfront development site as kind of a, things that are ahead. And on the right is a more recent photo of that. And to me, it's a reminder of the progress that has happened in this community, even through maybe one of our most difficult years. In fact, at least in my time here, most difficult year, that, we're continuing to make investments in the community, and you can kind of mark time, year to year with projects like this. And I know that it hasn't just been projects, it's been each of us as individuals that have grown over the last year as we've been faced with these different challenges. We've all also made our own individual progress, knowing it was a hard year. There's been ups and downs. There's not a person on this call, I'm certain, that hasn't had a really, really challenging, stressful year. And so I just want to recognize that internal growth as well as sort of the built environment growth. It's moments like this when we're presenting the budget that you kind of mark your time, right? And remember, like, oh, I remember that budget year. That was the one where she did this or where John did that. So thank you. Next slide. Last year, I presented the budget as base camp, and you'll remember I talked about, it takes a lot of work to get to base camp, takes a lot of training, but when you get there, you have the resources you need, you have the team you need, and you kind of wait in base camp until you get that opportunity to summit. And I was really thinking about at the time that we were kind of summiting COVID, like that's here this way to summit that, and really didn't really fully comprehend all of the different peaks and treks. And so it's not like we've been waiting in base camp for that opportunity to summit COVID. We've actually been going up and out and back and up and out and back over multiple challenges. I know you've all been a part of that too. So I think it's just a good reminder that we're continuing to climb. I'm going to stick with this climbing metaphor through the night, so you'll be able to distinguish the parts of the presentation that are mine from Twyla's, because mine will be hand drawn and photos, and hers will be graphs and numbers and a lot of great graphics as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to transition over, and Twyla's going to talk to you about the financial condition, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of the budget cycle process, the conditions at base camp when we were building the budget, and what's really included in this document that I think you're going to want to talk about the most. So with that, I'll turn it over to Twyla.
Great. Thank you, City Manager. Good evening. I'm Twyla Miller, the city's finance director, and tonight I will provide an update on the city's financial condition. In mid-February, I provided a preliminary overview of the general fund forecast, and tonight I'll provide you an update that incorporates changes to the forecast assumptions given what we know today about our current economic situation. The world has seen a significant amount of change and uncertainty over the last year due to the ongoing pandemic. Future impacts to our financial condition and the services needed by our community will be dependent upon the events that continue to unfold over the coming months as we navigate the pandemic and begin to phase into a new normal, while also understanding the longer-term community and economic impacts. Fortunately, the city has a long history of strong fiscal stewardship and service delivery to our community. Over time, we've developed a stable service system, maintained strong reserve levels, and have remained flexible to respond to the needs of the community in a constantly changing environment. This positions us well to face the challenges ahead. Next slide, please. Just a reminder that we have different fund types in our financial structure at the city, and tonight I'll be referring to the general fund as we discuss the financial condition of the city. While there are 35 reporting funds that fit into the categories shown here, the fund types shown in the lighter blue boxes represent funds used to account for revenue sources that are legally restricted for specific purposes, or to account for operations funded by users of the service through fees and charges. The general fund is used to account for all other financial resources not required to be accounted for in one of these other funds. After walking through the impacts to the general fund, we'll also look at the impact to a subset of special revenue and enterprise funds that staff are monitoring as revenues to these funds have been impacted by the pandemic. Next slide. As a reminder, when I'm discussing the general fund this evening, I'm referring to the main subfund, which represents the true discretionary funds for the city. This slide shows a snapshot of the FY22 proposed general fund budget, which is $914,000 higher than the FY21 adopted budget. The city manager will discuss specific budget actions a bit later this evening. The net budget after removing interfund transfers is $198.8 million. Next slide. The general fund forecast is a tool that projects how much the city will spend and receive over the next 6 years, assisting policymakers to develop strategies to meet future challenges. Finance staff regularly monitors and tracks a number of variables for the forecast, which are shown at a high level here. As the forecast ties to a set of assumptions at a point in time, it truly is a living document which will change as circumstances change. We continue to be in very uncertain and dynamic environment, and as we know more and continue to gain experience, the numbers in the future will be different than I'm going to show you today. With the additional economic uncertainty that is present in the current environment, as well as a wide range of possible outcomes, staff have been looking at a range of data that's been incorporated into the forecast. We are looking at our current experience with revenue collections, looking at ongoing economic impact on forecast drivers, following economic information both regionally and at the national level, connecting with key partners such as the Tax Assessor's Office, eWeb, and other jurisdictions. We've taken all of this information and have developed a general fund forecast that incorporates impacts to key variables. Next slide. So due to the cyclical nature of an economic downturn, there's likely to be continued impacts in a variety of areas over the next few years as we stabilize and recover. The general fund revenue areas you see here are those we expect to be the most impacted by the pandemic and other current events. The first is property taxes. As a reminder, property taxes are the largest revenue source in the general fund, which I'll discuss in more detail on the next slide. Contribution in lieu of taxes, or SILT from EWEB, is the second largest revenue source in the general fund. We've updated our forecast to align with EWEB's current projections, which include a 5% overall reduction in electric consumption due to the pandemic through 2023. The weather also plays a key role in SILT revenue, and payments for the most recent winter months were below projections. This equates to a reduction of about $600,000 annually in SILT revenue over the forecast period. Next are operating revenues. The forecast includes projected revenue reductions from recreation, library, and other charge for service, and also reduced rental income due to modified or interrupted operations due to the pandemic. Reduced operating revenues are expected to last through FY22, with the assumption that more normal revenue levels will return in FY23. Revenues were reduced by $2.6 million in FY21 and $2.4 million in FY22. And in the parking services fund was budgeted to make its final annual transfer to the general fund in FY21 for downtown police services. However, due to the impact from the pandemic on the parking fund, this transfer will not occur in this year. And then state marijuana taxes. Even though marijuana consumption has increased during the pandemic, cities across Oregon are receiving 72% less state marijuana tax revenue due to the passage of Measure 110 last November. The impact from lower state marijuana taxes is about $650,000 annually to the general fund. And then finally, GEMT, or Ground Emergency Medical Transport. These revenues previously have been deposited into the general fund, and they will be deposited into the ambulance transport fund starting in FY22. Next slide. So let's talk a bit more about property tax revenues, as it is our largest revenue source here. They're largely determined by the total taxable assessed value of property in Eugene and also the collection rate. These charts show the evolution of forecast assumptions from the pre-pandemic FY21 proposed budget to the FY21 adopted budget, which included amendments after the onset of the pandemic, to our current assumptions in the FY22 proposed budget forecast. Overall, current assumptions are more optimistic than previous assumptions made in the beginning of the pandemic, but we still don't expect to achieve pre-pandemic rates until the out years of the forecast. So let's start with the taxable assessed value growth rates in the green chart on the left. The FY21 certified growth rate was 4.1%, but it's important to note that this is based on pre-pandemic property values as of January 1st, 2020. The FY22 taxable assessed value growth rate is projected to be 3%, before rebounding incrementally to 4% in FY25 through the remainder of the forecast period. This is a more optimistic forecast than last spring, based on an analysis of taxable building permit activity. While there was a drop in taxable building permit activity in FY20 during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, FY21 appears to be on track with pre-pandemic levels. The current forecast also takes into consideration the potential for increased appeals and a degree of uncertainty in the commercial and industrial markets, as expressed by the tax assessor. Now let's look at the collection rates in the blue chart on the right. The projected property tax collection rate for the current year taxes is estimated at 94% in FY21, 94.5% in 22, and 95% for all subsequent years of the forecast period. The more optimistic forecast is based on an analysis of property tax payment data from the tax assessor and also the city's actual FY21 property tax receipts so far. Property tax payments do not appear to be impacted by the pandemic as much as we had initially projected last spring. While the majority of taxpayers pay in one lump in November to take advantage of early payment discounts, we will continue to monitor ongoing payments, including the third trimester payments due next month. The increased taxable assessed value growth rates and the collection rates assumed in the FY22 proposed budget translate into an additional $7.2 million in property tax revenue over the forecast period compared to the FY21 adopted budget. Next slide. So now I'll cover general fund expenses briefly. Personnel services comprise almost 97% 79% of the general fund operating budget, with materials and services making up the remaining 21%. We are a service organization, and it takes people to deliver the suite of services we provide to our community, which results in personnel costs being a larger component of our operating budget. Personnel services includes costs such as wages, healthcare, and retirement expenses. The proposed FY22 personnel services budget decreased by $233,000 or 0.2% compared to the FY21 adopted budget. This reduction is due to the one-time PERS employer incentive fund payment in FY21 and also the FY22 general fund budget reduction strategies that you'll hear more about a bit later. The FY22 general fund budget reduction strategies also contribute to the reduction in FY22 materials and services budget of $1.6 million or 4.3% as compared to the FY21 adopted budget. The overall inflation rates in this forecast are lower than predicted last year as well. The FY22 assumed inflation rate is 2.3% based on the September 2020 state economic forecast. Inflation rates beginning in FY23 are tied to the inflation percentages used by the State Office of Economic Analysis in their March 2021 forecast. Changes in the projected rate of inflation can have a large impact on the forecast, and this change lowered expenditures by about $1 million annually. There are some concerns as we look to the future about inflation increasing, and staff will be monitoring future inflation forecasts very carefully. Next, we'll take a closer look at PERS rates and expenses. We can go to the next slide. So this table shows the city's PERS contribution rates assumed in the current forecast, as well as estimated PERS costs for the general fund and all city funds combined. PERS rate changes occur in the even years, and the FY22 rates shown here were approved by the PERS board in October 2020. Based on the PERS actuaries' long-term projections for the system as a whole, employer contribution rates are projected to increase by another 1.52% of payroll in FY24, before leveling off with a slight decrease of 0.17% of payroll in FY26. Future PERS rates depend on a range of factors, most notably the rate of return achieved over time. 2020 was a volatile year for market returns, and after spending much of the year in negative territory, the Oregon Public Employees Retirement Fund finished 2020 with a positive 7.66% annual return, which exceeded the 7.2 rate assumption. You may recall the FY21 adopted budget included funding up to $8 million to participate in the PERS Employer Incentive Fund, or EIF, on a one-time basis. However, given the economic uncertainty caused by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the city made a lump sum contribution of $5 million in July 2020 and received an EIF match of $1.25 million. This will provide the city with an annual rate reduction of 0.4% of payroll as calculated by the PERS actuary. This rate reduction went into effect on September 1st, 2020, and the estimated savings through the remainder of FY21 is $393,000 across all city funds. For FY22, the savings associated with this rate reduction are estimated to be $495,000. Over the full 20-year amortization period, the city's PERS costs will be reduced by an estimated $11.4 million using the employer rate projection tool provided by PERS. Next slide. So in addition to the $750,000 in ongoing general fund reductions to departments that was incorporated into the FY21 adopted budget, additional measures have been taken since then. In FY21, to help mitigate continued financial uncertainty, additional actions were taken, including one-time savings of $2.1 million that was achieved through department underspending, and our non-represented employees did not receive a scheduled wage increase this year, which equates to an ongoing impact in the forecast of about $1 million annually. In the FY22 proposed budget reduction strategies of $4.6 million are incorporated along with $3.9 million in investments in key areas. The city manager will share more information on the FY22 items shortly, but all of these actions have been incorporated into the FY22 proposed budget forecast. Next slide. So to understand the impact of changes in the current forecast and additional future budget actions that may be needed, we will first look at the surplus deficit and then the reserve for revenue shortfall. The annual operating surplus deficit helps us understand if we're living within our means. Do we have a stable service system where revenues are greater than or equal to expenditures? I'm going to show you two lines so that we can compare the surplus deficit with and without future budget actions. So first, I'd like to point out the red line in the middle of the chart, which represents a neutral position where revenues equal expenditures. Anything above the red line is a surplus, which increases our reserves, and anything below the red line is a deficit, which reduces reserves. So the solid blue line shows the surplus deficit in our current forecast, which includes the key driver updates I just talked about, FY21 additional budget actions, and the FY22 general fund budget reduction strategies and investments. The current forecast also assumes another ongoing $2.5 million in future reduction strategies starting in FY24. This additional reduction strategy is needed in order to move from a projected deficit position to a neutral position in 25, and eventually a surplus in the out years. Additionally, the long-term forecast does not include out-year funding for investments that have been funded on a one-time basis through FY22, including downtown, climate, and homelessness services. Additional budget or service level adjustments may be needed in FY23 to continue serving the community in these areas, which has not yet been quantified. And if you want to click one more time, Vicki, the dotted green line represents the current forecast without the assumed future reduction strategy. This would result in a deficit for most of the forecast period, which would not be sustainable with our current level of reserves. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about our savings account, which is formerly known as the Reserve for Revenue Shortfall. This reserve is our financial cushion, which is the key part of our financial management. Our current situation with the economic impacts of the pandemic are exactly why it is important to have an adequate reserve. Having a reserve has allowed us to weather unexpected events and take time to develop thoughtful strategic responses rather than having to immediately take action to cut services. Additionally, having a sufficient reserve is a factor in our high credit rating, which translates into lower borrowing costs for the city, saving taxpayer resources over the long term. Moody's, our credit rating agency, recognizes the strong financial management of the city, including maintaining strong reserve levels, which is a key metric in their valuation. So if you want to, there we go. This line represents our savings account target of 8% of general fund expenditures, or about $14.6 million per year on average over the forecast period. Next, please. There we go. The solid blue line shows the projected reserve in the current forecast, which includes the additional $2.5 million in future reduction strategies previously mentioned. The reserve trends downward over the next few years before increasing again beyond FY25. This trend is consistent with the projected surplus deficit we just reviewed on the previous slide. And then finally, the green dotted line, which is shown there, represents our current forecast without assumed future reduction strategies, which would not be sustainable with our current level of reserves. As you can see, the reserve would be depleted by FY25 without further mitigation. The goal with the proposed budget approach is to leave at least $4 million in reserves in the short term and to achieve at least a 4% reserve in the out years of the forecast to provide a financial cushion against uncertainty, which I'll talk about next. Thank you. We continue to monitor areas of uncertainty related to the general fund forecast and our financial condition. The EWEB SILT forecast was already trending lower before the onset of the pandemic due to warmer winter weather and fewer rate increases. The ongoing pandemic continues to apply farther downward pressure on SILT revenue as businesses close or modify operations. We're also watching the FCC order on Comcast revenues. A rule change by the Federal Communications Commission preempts local governments from regulating or imposing fees related to non-cable service providers that rely on use of the public right-of-way. Although the new rule took effect in September of 2019, Comcast is still collecting the fees from their customers and remitting payments to the city. The city could realize an ongoing revenue reduction of $3.5 million annually, depending on the outcome of the pending litigation regarding this FCC rule change. And then there's the pandemic. Although vaccines bring us hope and optimism, the ongoing pandemic has been very unpredictable, as is evident by Lane County's move back to extreme risk category this coming Friday. Variants and the threat of additional waves bring continued uncertainty about how events will unfold over the coming months, including when we return to more normal and what that looks like once we're there. Property taxes, again, we discussed earlier how those revenues in the current forecast have increased from last spring, although current estimates are still below pre-pandemic projections, and there's continued uncertainty as we look to the future. Personnel costs are another area we watch. As our services are heavily dependent on the people who do the work, personnel costs are a large component of our budget. Over the next 2 years, contracts with our major unions will be expiring, and we are or will be having labor discussions with our union partners. Currently, all employee wage groups' wage considerations tied to CPI in the out years of the forecast. Also, there are a range of factors that impact PERS rates. Although participation in the Employee Incentive Fund will help reduce our PERS costs, it does not lock in a specific rate, but it helps to lower our future rates as determined by the actuary. And then there's the state marijuana tax. As I mentioned earlier, less state marijuana tax revenue will be distributed to cities due to the passage of Measure 110. The current legislative session includes House Bill 2015 that, if approved, would allow cities to increase their local marijuana tax from 3% up to 10%, which could potentially be used to make up for lost state tax revenue. Next slide. So we've spent a lot of time talking this evening about the general fund, but the pandemic has impacted all of our funds to some extent, and I wanted to show a few that have been impacted more than others. This graph shows revenue projections for these funds showing pre-pandemic levels in 2019 and the impact to revenues from COVID anticipated through 2022. Of course, the true impact to these funds is dependent upon a range of factors, including what happens with the pandemic over the coming year, when we return to normal, and what normal looks like. Staff continue to monitor all of our funds, and the FY22 proposed budget general fund forecast does not include additional support for distressed funds. Any support needed would come through a supplemental budget process in the future. Next slide. And so finally, I'll end my section here by talking about reserves a bit more. The approach with our reserve levels in the general fund has not changed from the proposed budget last spring to have at least $4 million in reserve in any 1 year and meet our 4% target at a minimum by the end of the forecast period. While this doesn't meet our 8% target and it isn't ideal, this is a prudent approach given what we know today and the range of uncertainty as we look to the future. This allows us to keep serving our community without overcorrecting in the near term for things that may or may not happen. However, we don't want to draw our reserves down any lower. Our credit rating agency, Moody's, has noted the strong financial management of the city over many years in previous credit reviews. While Moody's looks at a range of factors in their analysis, they have consistently noted that the city's strong reserve levels, our willingness to take action when necessary, and the expectation that city's management team will deliver long-run structural balance featuring strong financial metrics. While it isn't unexpected that an entity would draw down their reserves during a crisis like a pandemic, indeed, this is exactly why we have a reserve, Moody's will expect that as we stabilize, replenishing our reserve levels to provide financial stability will be a priority. Failure to do so could lead to a downgrade to our credit rating in the future. While Moody's provides an annual credit review, we will be issuing the remaining bond authority for the Park bond series in FY22, which will require a formal bond rating with Moody's analysts. They will be looking to see how we are managing through the pandemic and positioning ourselves for the long term as they complete our review. I expect Moody's to be watching our approach to managing this time of uncertainty as we balance the use of reserves and taking appropriate budget actions in a timely manner to ensure our financial stability. As we come out of the pandemic and continue to stabilize across the organization, it will be very important to rebuild our reserves back up to our target level to have a financial cushion for future unexpected events and to show continued strong financial management. Now I'll hand things back over to the city manager to talk more about the FY22 proposed budget.
Thank you, Twyla. You're a rock. It's really helpful. So last year I had a different slide that really kind of outlined a strategic planning process, and the budget process was one of those bubbles. And this year I was just going to focus on this because I think it's important to understand kind of where we are at all times of the year when we're thinking about the budget. And I realized as you were presenting, Twyla, that one of my favorite slides that talks about how we're always in 3 years is, I probably should have dropped in here, but I do think it's interesting, especially if you're newish to the budget committee or council, to recognize that in any given year, we're always sort of in 3 fiscal years. We're kind of wrapping up the last year, we're planning for the current year, we're planning for the next year, and we're implementing the current year. So, but in a general calendar year, we're spending a lot of time as an executive team on the budget. Like right now, we're proposing it, and you're going to review it, you're going to amend it, you're going to make a recommendation to the council who will adopt it. And then we'll move into sort of implementation, and we're implementing the full year, but I'm just sort of neatly put it on the bottom. And we'll continue to monitor and provide, get feedback and adjust. And that's really what that supplemental budget process is about. We'll, continue to do that kind of strategic planning work, which is like surveying people and understanding what, council's goals are. And that really builds into how we plan. And then we kind of adjust and prepare. And so we're always in this process. And I can't think of a year where that process has been more, I would say, challenging in terms of information changing. And, again, I want to thank the department budget managers, because we delayed a lot this year, hoping to see how numbers would change. And do we really have to do this? And do we not have to do that? And will we get any certainty? So those are kind of just the conditions that I want to talk about at base camp. You can move it forward. I was going to try to do it myself, but I can't. So I want to talk about, just sort of like during that planning and preparation process, what we knew. What we knew for sure is that we were not in a short-term environment. As you might recall, last year, we thought, it was potential that we'd be in the fall of last year and we'd start to crawl out of this. And now here we are again, it's a solid year later. And I wonder if we're going to be having this same conversation in another year as we move back up to extreme. We knew that as Twyla said, we knew that all of our funds are impacted. That's another situation that's never happened in my career. We've always had other funds we could kind of lean into and help out. And this year we have not had that. We knew coming into this budget year that when we presented last year, we had probably a somewhere around $7 million that we were going to have to solve for over a series of years. And we didn't want to be too fast with that and solve it too quick, and really just be responsive to the situation and try to protect and preserve services and jobs. We did know, actually, what was helpful was we had a first round of council goal conversations in the winter, where we had an opportunity to talk about what councilors were hearing from their constituents. We had an opportunity to talk about, we had a conversation about sort of upstream and downstream. When you think about a river, like what investments should we be making upstream to help us with some of these downstream issues? And we kind of got a real good, I would say, got a pretty good understanding of where council was going to land with those, with their goals. And we've had an opportunity to do some surveying out in the community around COVID that helps inform some of our work. We also know that there's been a long-standing goal of council, which is not going to shift as they adopt their new goals, of having a long-term sustainable budget, and included, in one of the top 5 things that they want to evaluate me on is maintaining fiscal health and stability of the organization. So we knew that, and we knew we were going to need to make progress even during a really challenging time. As you all know, the needs in the community right now are not less than they were before the pandemic. And it just doesn't feel like we can wait until we have new revenues or new opportunities. We actually need to shift some services and shift some resources in order to make a bigger impact. So that's what we knew. You can go to the next slide. What we didn't know. We definitely, even though we know it's going to be a long trail ahead, we don't know how long it's going to last. There's really not a lot of certainty. Our emergency operations center was up and running when I presented the budget to you last year, and it's still up and running now. And special thanks to Chief Heppel for his just incredible leadership over the last year. I can't tell you how much our organization has come to rely on his information in our biweekly all city meetings. And he's just done a really great job, and it's gone on a really long time. We think we're close. We get vaccines, our numbers go back up. We didn't know, we still don't know exactly what all the operational impacts are going to be in terms of, what are the OHA guidelines, CDC guidelines, the pivot for doing services from home in different ways. All of those have different kinds of impacts. So it's not just revenue, it's also where we're spending. We weren't sure what tools we would have, whether we would get any kind of funding from the federal government, the state. We weren't sure at that time if any of that was a possibility. We weren't sure because we start in the winter. We weren't sure whether, you know, as we had pretty good solid understanding where the majority of the council was, how would that change as we get new council members? Would there be new priorities? And we certainly weren't certain at all of where the community conversations were going to go around the community safety initiative or the ad hoc police reform committee. So there's a lot of things out there that we just didn't know. You can go to the next slide. So some of you know this, I hiked the Appalachian Trail many years ago, and I used this reference in a different project with the city council, but the whole Appalachian Trail is marked from one end to the other with these white trail blazes. So if you get lost, you can always see that kind of next white blaze. And all of the side trails are with a blue blaze. And so this is a little bit of a blue blaze slide, because I know you're going to have questions about the American Rescue Plan. And I'm just going to provide you a tiny bit of information that I actually provided to council a couple of weeks ago when we talked about their values and goals. And so if you're mayor and council, you can probably like pay less attention now because you've heard all of this. So there's still a lot of details unknown, and we expect to get criteria, potentially a payment and criteria in May. But I do want to talk about a little bit of the numbers of what we think is coming and what the criteria is. So this is like mission control here. I have like papers everywhere. But we do know that as the funds come in, as they're available, that they will be available to respond to COVID-19. So direct costs related to that and direct economic impacts related to that. We know, at least this is what we've been told so far, that we'll be able to recover some of our revenue impacts. We'll be able to make some investments in critical infrastructure investments. And there's a piece in there that talks about pay to essential workers. We don't have any of the criteria around what that means, but right now what we know is that it's potential that those funds could be used up until December 2024. So it gives us we have time. We have time to have a thoughtful conversation about how we want to invest those. We're currently having staff do some modeling and analysis around just the numbers that Twyla's already given you. So if we receive these funds and we spread them out over the years, how does that impact us, and how would that maybe change some of those decisions? So with that, I would like to just go through a little bit of the numbers, highest level. So you just have to push next. So the overall plan is a $1.9 trillion plan. And among other things, the ARP provides $350 billion to help states, counties, cities, and tribal governments cover increased expenditures and all the things I just said to you before. So of that, next, Oregon, sort of statewide. So all of the cities in the state, all statewide is set to receive about $4.2 billion. And of that $4.2 billion, 2.6 of that will be an allocation to the state, and an additional, I believe, $150 million of capital. And we've had a number of requests that came in around what would be some needs that we have that came from our state legislature. So that's just sort of big picture. Next. And of that, if the numbers still come true, the city of Eugene is slated to receive about $35.5 million. Lane County is slated to get about 74.1, and the city of Springfield around 13.8. Those numbers are based on our sort of HUD CDBG numbers, so it's population based. So that 35.5 million is the city of Eugene's population. Lane County's includes that, so they get that, and then so it's a really nice way to provide, I think, some community-wide resiliency as part of that. Right now, I think as I explained to council, we have a lot of hope, and what I need to see now is some clarity and some certainty so that we can plan around that. Council had a discussion about this at their goals meeting and want to have a council meeting to talk about what those priorities will be. We talked a lot about organizational resilience and then what are those community needs. So we'll be doing that as soon as we get the funding and the resources. I know that the budget committee is going to have an interest in this, and I feel like, I hope, starting down a trust path with you, that when we're doing supplemental budgets, I'm going to call you back together so we can talk about that. And that would be my full intent here, is that once we've had some conversations around that, that we would come back together so you would have an opportunity to weigh in on that supplemental budget. Next. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the exec team approach to this year's budget. And we're just going to have to roll through these bullets, Vicki. Next bullet. First thing we did was we set that target. We started off with a general fund target of about $4.5 million, feeling like that would be the right amount to not over respond, but also still be able to make an impact. Next slide. We kind of doubled down on our team values that I talked about last year. And I probably talked more, gave you the sort of full sentences around that, but just to keep the high level, that we're going to continue to be open, resourceful, and persistent. We're going to be creative, that in all ways, when people are remembering us, that we've been caring and that we've been equitable and that we've been accountable and all in. This is an all city, whole city approach. Next slide. In addition to that, I think I provided additional guidance to the team as I was thinking about how do you start to create those priorities and set those targets. And to me, it felt like the budget should always be a reflection of the priorities that have been established by the council, and should also be a reflection of the operational needs that we know of the organization, of the community. And without having just a full-on discussion about what are your priorities, I think, I look to recent decisions to include last year's budget. How did council talk about this? How did you talk about this? How did things get sort of moved around? What is the allocation of resources? I also look to some of the most recent conversations around establishing a Parks and Rec levy, establishing a library levy, establishing road bond. I mean, there's a really clear, and it's been clear through my entire career, that this council has values all of the services that the city provides. So we tried to, you'll see that reflected in kind of how things got portioned out. Next one. We talked about being, to the extent, anything we learned during the pandemic that would help us think like, how can we shift a service? Anything we can do to create that resiliency and be ready. And I mean ready, not just to respond to what a community needs, but as opportunities come up for either grant funding, federal funding, that our budget could be really responsive to that and could bounce back quickly. So if there was an opportunity to add something back, we could add it back, and to try not to have anything be too long lasting or painful for anybody. Next question. And that we would just sort of simplify and focus on this process. There's so many things going on. And I just want to say, for all of our staff members, I mean, our whole city has been following these OHA guidelines so well. And really, they've turned their kitchens and living rooms and back garden sheds into offices, and don't have a lot of extra capacity or reserves to do a lot of extra work. So you'll see some things in this budget. For example, we didn't redo the UNA this year. So the unfunded needs assessment, I felt like the work we had put into it up to the last year was still extremely relevant. And the uncertainty with the pandemic and all the things going on made it really difficult to understand what's really a current unfunded need versus an unfunded need that's longer term. So we took a pause on that for a year, and we'll have been leaning into the one that we gave you last year. Next slide. We did also, I really can't emphasize enough, we still have all of those forecasts that we talk about don't include. So what's in the forecast, and this is always what's, I think, hard to understand, is that when we build something in one time, it drops off the next year. So when you look at those numbers and you look at needing to make a $2.5 million reduction, that doesn't include the one-time things that drop off again. And we're going to talk about some of those one-time things, but I think to the extent we can start to move things to ongoing is where we get the sustainability. And And this year I was even, challenging the creativity to say, are there things that we're doing ongoing right now that we actually should switch to one time, to put the one-time things into ongoing, because they seem like they're becoming the priorities. So we had lots of conversations like that, and you'll see me continue to try to get things into that ongoing category. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about first some of the investments we made, because again, we were making reductions also in order to shift into new investments. So one of the ones that we talk a lot about is is supporting our ambulance services. So it's been a service. Well, it's been a funding issue gap for a long time, and we've done a lot of innovations over the year. It continues to be. So we are making a general fund investment in continuing to support the ambulance transport fund. And I also want to say that part of that's associated with that is we also are making some changes to the GEMT. And we talked about this last year at the budget committee, and one of the things that was funded last year was a fire audit. We have not completed the fire merger audit, but we did dive into the ambulance transport fund to try to realign the FTE and make sure we had all the right people and materials charging to that fund, to just make it really clear that this is what is doing ambulance transport. And then my budget proposes moving all the GEMT into the ambulance transport fund and having that be an ongoing investment. And I think it makes sense. It's really clear, it's really transparent. And I think if somebody, even just based on the conversations you had last year, even though we know going into the general fund makes it more flexible and we can still move it over, I think if you're the general public trying to understand our funds, this probably makes more sense. So that's one area. Downtown, all of our downtown operations have been pretty much funded with one-time dollars. So our downtown ambassadors, our cultural events, a lot of our facilities work, we ramped up that investment several years ago. And I don't know how that's not an ongoing investment, as especially this year, as you see all of the support that downtown is going to need coming out of the pandemic. So a downtown investment here also includes an ongoing investment in the downtown manager position. So that's a shift for us. And we're continuing to fund the downtown ambassadors for another year, who I think are becoming kind of like the favorite city employees for all the amazing things they do and the ways they help people out downtown. They pitched in big time during COVID with outreach to the unsheltered, and it's just been a tremendous resource. We're making a pretty significant investment in homelessness in this budget. There's $300,000 in ongoing dollars for the homelessness work and staffing work, and another 450, maybe I have my numbers wrong, I have to look over here, in one-time dollars. This is in addition to all of the investments we made last year and through the supplemental budget and through COVID that have been, close to $2 million, it feels like, and it feels like it's still a huge community need. So we're making that investment. A couple of things, let me just, hold on. I'm like trying to look at a couple of things that are smaller numbers, but still important investments that I want to call attention to. The Bethel neighborhood capacity building. We have had multiple conversations with council around neighborhood planning. We're wrapping up the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan. In fact, I think it's in front of council in a couple of weeks, the next work session about that. And then the next up after that is University Neighbors. And then the next up after that is Bethel. And the neighborhood has a clear desire to get going. And so this budget proposes an investment in kind of jumpstarting that capacity building. So it's a $20,000 investment in neighborhoods in order to help them start to build their capacity. It's kind of how we started in River Road, and I think it will help them be ready and can kind of get that moving faster. There's a small investment, ongoing investment in our City Hall office transition. So as you know, I'm sitting in the Lane Community College, Mary Spildy Center, City Manager's office, and that that had an addition into our budget, but I will say this, it's less than what we were going to have to invest to stay in the Lane County Public Service Building. We were coming off of multiple years of 0% rent, and the rent increase would have been more than what we're paying here, and we're getting more space. So it's a really smart deal. I can't wait until you're here and we can have this meeting here. Last year, we had every year the city does we do the mathematical allocation of the CDBG funds to Human Services Commission. And for a number of years, it was set at a specific rate. I think it was maybe $350,000. And we give you the max of we give them the max of what we can. So when that number dipped down, because our allocation dipped down, there's been a number of years, many of you have been a part of it, where we've had budget committee members bring forward motions to build that back up to the 350. So it would be 50. And we've done that every year. And this year I built that 50 in because it feels like that's just been a clear priority. And I think it makes sense to do it. And so I built that in. And then again, as much as I wanted to make the climate recovery position ongoing, and I have some ideas about that in the future, we did at least continue another year of the full staffing of that. I think you can go to the next one. All right, so some of the shifts and reductions. I wanted to just first, like the pie chart on the left just talks about kind of like the breakdown of how much was one time and how much was ongoing. So we do have a $4.6 million reduction. Most of that is one time. Some of that is 2 times, and there's a small amount of that is ongoing. I wanted it to be more ongoing, but it was really difficult to get there. And the chart on the right will show you that it's very much aligned with kind of how the budget is allocated. And that's really how we did it, because I did feel like that was a pretty clear thing I could lean on to say these have tended to be the priorities in the resource allocation. So that's how that worked. You can go to the next slide. All right, so here's a couple of highlights, and I know there's a number of them in there, and you can turn to page 17, and the exec team is here. So if there's questions you have after you get through your full rounds, we're happy to answer them tonight or tomorrow. I want to just say this was not easy. We picked a target, and then I have to tell you that almost every day somebody would call me and say, this is so hard. This is so hard. And it's been really a really challenging year, because the ability to flex internally in the ways that we were able to do during the recession, we're kind of tapped out. We've used all of those tools, and we're kind of down to much more difficult choices. So with that, the team got incredibly creative. They took all of our values, all of the ideas about how do we innovate, how do we continue to provide services, and came up with a package. These are the ones that I think are the big ones that you'll have questions about. First one is the fire engine shift to a community response unit. I put the page numbers front and center because I think Chief Heppel and his team did a really good job on pages 40 and 41 of really explaining this. And I think also really explains kind of a long history of innovation in this department. The fire engine shift to the CRU, both this and the ALS to BLS, were proposed as a 2-year strategy. The fire engine shift to CRU is kind of an interesting one, because the CRU is actually part of our community safety initiative plan, and something that we are hoping that when the plan is that CSI funding comes in and we can restore the engine. But in the meantime, we have an opportunity to experiment with a different type of service, deploying people in kind of a really distinct area where we know the types of calls that might be lower acuity calls. And Chief Heppel can talk a lot about this, but it was an idea, and a good idea, that we'll definitely be implementing as part of CSI. And it's a 2-year strategy that actually comes with some savings and some abilities to do some other things. So the second one is the ALS to BLS. That one's explained also really well on page 41. This takes one of the advanced life support units and turns it into basic life support, actually provides more hours of service overall to the entire system, but it's a little bit of a different service type. The next big one is vacancy savings and EPD. That is about a $1.7 million item. Part of that will go to funding the downtown police station. So we don't have, as you know, we don't have the downtown parking. So we have to figure out how to fund it. We're trying to figure out how to fund it with savings from across. And so EPD is part of that, is in trying to absorb that. The vacancy savings, there's also vacancy savings in probably every department, but in LRCS, Public Works, and Central Services, all of these departments tried to come up with vacancies that were either one-time or ongoing, things that would have the least amount of impact. So it could be something like a position at Sheldon Pool that we know the pool is going to be under construction. Can we hold that vacant for that construction period and contribute those funds towards the investments I talked about earlier? So that's what most of those are. And then lots of materials and supplies. And again, I put that down there. And even as I was putting the bullet materials and supplies, these are really these are things that you're going to want us to do, right? We're kind of down to that level. It was very difficult. And I look forward to hearing what questions you might still have about that. Next slide. Things that are still ahead. So, I mean, I wrote FY22, 23 and beyond, because we're still trying to figure it out. You know, the housing and homelessness, we have some immediate now issues that we're working on, and I'm excited about this budget because of the investments that it's going to make. But we know that we still have funding that we're going to need to find, ongoing funding to implement some of the TAC report. And all of the things that we're doing right now that we're funding with COVID dollars and that potentially could be funded with ARPA dollars also have an end point. And we need to be able to figure out how are we going to sustain these services if we continue to have people that are living in these kind of crisis situations. We have a lot of work to do around climate recovery. This year, more than any year, really raised the equity lens for everybody in terms of all of the work, racial equity. And it's something that our organization is also really excited to kind of launch in. I put it on this list because we recently chose 2 different teams of race and equity advisors inside the city. They've just been notified. They're just going to be kicking off their work that's going to advise me and the exec team directly on racial equity issues in the organization and community. And I 100% anticipate that there'll be some resource needs that come with that will be part of some supplemental budget for sure, or for sure the FY23 budget. We still have a lot to determine around community safety and the payroll tax. And I think this is going to be on the next slide as well. But thinking about how are we going to, it's still uncertain how much of the payroll tax we're going to get in. We've been taking bridge loans that we need to pay back, and there's conversations happening. So I just think there's a lot to think about around that, figuring out how we're going to fund downtown operations. And then I just like to always point out that we also have other levies that are going to come to an end, and that either need to be renewed or we need to make a different decision about how we're going to do that service. Next slide. And then it's not all uphill. I don't think I wanted that to be a slide, but I think it's more of a kind of like an escalator. But there's some things to look forward to. So we talk a lot about the Riverfront project, the Riverfront Park. I think it's gonna open this year. People are gonna be able to get out there and really enjoy it. And I think that's gonna be a really good time. Those projects, as they get underway and provide housing, are gonna also kind of help with other growth. The farmers market should be under construction this year. Very exciting project. And I know a lot of people love it. We have a lot of work to do around continuing to do the payroll tax. I won't cover that again. But then all of the parks and recreation projects, transportation projects are coming. They're moving along. As Katie said Katie Marowitz in a presentation earlier today, last year we had the biggest road construction year ever, and we're set up to do it again. And it's not just roads, it's roads and transportation and parks. And so there's a lot going on. And we're continuing to pivot our organization, which is really fun and also challenging. This kind of reminds me of like since I've been on the trail analogy, I remember going on a long backpacking trip as a kid. It was 2 weeks long. It seemed like forever. And all I wanted was a cheeseburger the entire time. So this is like kind of like the cheeseburger. We get to have one. Next slide. I think there's a next slide. All right. So, I picked these images with some intention, right? Because this year feels so different to me in terms of even how this budget process is going to work. It's not like it's just like, it's all these different pieces that are going to still continue to come together while we're meeting, after we meet. It's just, I think this is not going to be like here's your proposed budget and here we go. There's just going to be a lot of things that continue to move because we're having conversations around the CSI, around the ad hoc committee, continued conversations around homelessness, the ARPA funds. So there's just a lot going on there. I will just say that I feel really good about this budget. I feel really good about the work that the executive team did to bring together something that would like keep us safe and hold us through these challenges. It wasn't easy. There's things that I don't like in it. And I think there's gonna be things in there you don't like. None of us want to cut any of these services, but I think they put together a solid plan that keeps us stable, and I'm really appreciative. So that's all of the information, and I look forward to your feedback and your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, City Manager. That was an excellent presentation. So the next thing up that we have is our round robin, but I think that given the length of this meeting, now would be a great time to take a 5-minute break, give everyone a chance to process everything we just heard, formulate our thoughts a little. So if we can reconvene at about 6:40, that I think would be wonderful. And we'll come back and do our round robin and get into the discussion. going to start with just a round robin, give every member of the committee up to 3 minutes to give their initial thoughts. Please try to keep this portion to comments only so that we can just work through the list and hear what everyone has to say. We won't be pausing in this round for questions from staff. And then we'll come back after everyone has had their first opportunity, and we will then do a round 2 for anyone who wants it. That will be your opportunity to ask all the questions I know we all have. And then we'll do rounds as needed until we've talked this through. So we're going to start out with our first 2 people will be Councilor Zelenka, followed by Eliza Kaczynski. So take it away.
Thank you, Ty. I don't have a lot to say at this point. I really appreciate the thought and the presentation that was given. The thought went into the presentation that was given by the staff, and I look forward to delving into it a little bit more. And again, there's a lot of things that are still outstanding on this budget that I know we want to work on, but this isn't the right time because they're just not ripe, including all the ARPA funds and what to do about police reform and what about the CSI. And there's a whole bunch of things that we are going to be doing over time, but and I look forward to having those conversations as well once we get through this budget. And then we can make modifications of the budget in the supplemental budget or as we need when we go through those processes. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor. Eliza, followed by Councilor Syret.
So I first wanted to thank everyone for all the work that they've done over this past year. It's been a year of crisis after crisis after crisis, and just the level of dedication and commitment is truly appreciated. I know this is a really, really difficult budget, and it's going to be some really difficult discussions. And I think having those discussions without any sort of sense of what some of the priorities are for this relief funding is going to be exceedingly difficult, because what we're looking at here is looking at a lot of cuts, a lot of painful cuts. Some of those cuts might be easy to undo once we get greater clarity of what we're going to use the relief money for. Other cuts might be more difficult to undo. We're already getting people saying, like, please don't make this change, don't make that change. This is really essential. And so at the very least, getting a sense of what are the things that we're talking about cutting that would be higher priorities would be, I think, very useful, because when we're really looking at this, it's not really a good use of our time to kind of sit and say, well, we need to save this, or we should, cut that instead, if those things aren't actually going to materialize down the road. It's very difficult to have discussions about where we may want to look at funding going somewhere else if that money is going to come outside of this budget. So I recognize the difficulties in incorporating a lot of these ongoing discussions into this format, and with the deadlines and everything, but just saying like, oh, we'll talk about that later. And I also want to really appreciate the commitment to have budget committee discuss supplemental budgets in a more robust way. I think that's going to help. But thinking about how that might affect this budget that we have in front of us is, I think, going to be important. I also, I'll kind of stop there and save more detailed things for the second part.
Thank you. Councilor Syret will be followed by John Jasper.
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to thank the Chair for giving us a break, a 5-minute break. I super appreciate that. And I also I was pleased to hear the city manager explicitly make a commitment to involving the budget committee in the supplemental budget process, because hopefully we'll have clarity about the recovery funds at that point in terms of how much we get and what any restrictions are over them. And I just really want to appreciate staff and the city manager's thoughtful approach to this super challenging situation when things are so dynamic. It is really the least ideal situation for developing and presenting a city budget, which has to be done within certain restrictions and timelines and state law, and is supposed to be anticipating our needs, our position, excuse me, at a future date. And under our city manager's leadership, this process has been handled with grace and intelligence and has really put us in, at least for me, is instilling a lot of confidence in terms of how we are going to weather the uncertainty that we're facing. So I just want to share that appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. John will be followed by Councillor Semple.
Thank you. And thank you, city manager and staff. I appreciate all the work that you've done. I also appreciate that the GEMT was moved into the ambulance transport fund. That's something that was a topic that I discussed last year, and I really appreciate seeing that adjustment. The community response unit seems like a good way to increase accessibility, reduce the carbon footprint, consistent with the CRO. I'm excited by the prospect and really appreciative of Chief Heppel's out of the box thinking to propose this plan as a way to prioritize meeting the needs of the community. However, I do have very significant concerns about the reduction of the fire apparatus from Station 2, especially in light of the critical services that we've seen the fire provide during the pandemic, and then accentuated by the absolute devastation of the Holiday Farm fire and all the other fires in the area. I just have a very, very big problem with reducing our fire capacity. I'll have a few questions for Chief Heppel in the follow-up round. But, I've used in the past the analogy of funding like a donut, that we have all these great ideas and I'm supportive of them, but in the process of doing these extra projects and activities, we end up sometimes neglecting the funding of the core responsibilities of the city. I think it's great, that we're supporting eWeb and United Way and homelessness and the farmers market and all the capital improvement programs ongoing, but we're literally doing it at the expense of risking people's lives. So with that, I'll close and I'll come back at a time when I can ask Chief Heppel some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Semple will be followed by Kath.
Thank you. I have some small questions, so I guess I'll save those fascinating things for the next round. I knew this was going to be a really, really hard budget, and I'm impressed with the dedication and the empathy that's gone into it. So I think we're in good hands. I know it's frustrating because a lot of changes are going to be due to the reports we get, and we don't have them yet. So we're kind of budgeting in the dark, but I think we all realize that's where we are. And yes, it's great that the budget committee will be included in the supplemental budget. I think the community safety initiative dollars are going to be a really big discussion point. And I saw that the CSI funds are paying for the rest stops and microsites, and then also to the Human Services Commission. So I'm just wondering how much those are. I have frustration with the online budget tool. It doesn't go very far. And is that on purpose, or am I not handling it right? But it's really challenging to get anywhere with it. But thank you. It's a really hard year. You've done a great job, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Catherine will be followed by Councillor Evans.
Thank you. I found that going later in the list means you can say like what everybody else said already, which is kind of helpful. I think everything that everyone said about just like the appreciation of the thoughtfulness and the time and really just attention that has gone into this. I don't think that can be overstated at this point, given the situation that we're in. I really appreciate kind of the commitment to involving budget committee down the road. I think it makes me feel less kind of angsty about like, oh, like I want to figure things out now, but I know we can't figure things out now. So that's kind of like that already has sort of eased a little bit of that for me. So I really appreciate that. And I think for, you know, sort of for the use of the ARPA funds, for talking about like, I think of CSI and sort of like it's its own thing, right? But it also within each of those pieces overlap with other things, other programs that are funded by other parts in the city also. And so I'm hoping that we can, in the context of knowing that there's future conversations, future decisions that need to be made, through this process, have a little bit more kind of grounding and really understanding and wrapping our brains around like what those things look like currently, what the conversations are that are happening, especially around, I think, kind of homelessness and policing and all of those, kind of how all of those parts fit together. I know that there are a lot of policy decisions that are still happening and conversations at council. And I don't know that there have been sort of spaces made around kind of budget and funding parts in a lot of that in the same way that there has been on the policy side. And so kind of trying to think about how can this be an avenue and kind of a channel to start talking about some of that. And thinking about a lot of the feedback from folks in the community and the concerns that are being raised there, I think are very much in that zone also. So hoping we can have kind of future discussion there. The other thing I just wanted to kind of generally bring up was thinking about like kind of metrics in terms of what the city does. And I would love, I don't know who is kind of the right person to talk to about, you know, what might there already be, but kind of shifting the focus from talking about outputs more to outcomes, and not just sort of number of widgets purchased, you know, for example, but like the quality of those widgets and the actual impact that they had on people's lives. And the services that we're offering. And so that's kind of a separate but bigger picture conversation that I would just love to be able to kind of follow up on.
Thank you. Councillor Evans will be followed by Raina Jackson.
I'll be brief. I want to thank the staff for putting this together. You do an excellent job every year. And now I'm going to pass because I cannot come behind all these people and say what they just said. So move on.
Thank you. Raina will be followed by Councillor Ye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you to city manager and staff for this. The biggest thing for me, it kind of touches on what Catherine was saying when I see the numbers here, for example, for homelessness services and 750,000 total, my mind immediately goes to, again, what that impact is or what that service component is going to look like so that we know, well, is it making a dent or are we chipping away at it, or how much is this doing in regards to what people are saying they need? And I think just taking a look at that in the other areas too, for the downtown safety, for example, for saying it's a one time for the next fiscal year, then what is that one time really getting us in terms of the longer term goal? And that will help bring clarity later on to future conversations, for me at least.
Thank you. Councillor Ye will be followed by Ryan Moore.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to thank all the staff that were involved in preparing this, and Sarah and Twyla. Twyla has such a talent for making all of these complex concepts very understandable, and I appreciate every time she does a presentation for us. I also will just do what Catherine did, and I agree with what other people have said. Thank you so much. I did want to point out, this may not be new, but it's the first time I noticed the little pages in the corner of the slides that tell you what page number. I love that. So if it is new, keep it. And if it's not, I'm sorry, I didn't notice it before.
Thank you. Ryan will be followed by Councillor Keating.
Thank you. And just as Catherine and Councillor Ye said, it's easier going later because everyone has said the thank yous. And I appreciate how horribly difficult it is to make some of these decisions, especially knowing that many of these decisions in many different areas of city government impact lives. They may not have pure dollar costs. There may be life and livelihood components to those as well. So it's, these are all factors in every single decision that is made going into this, I would say, in some way or other. But to get away from that, I do just want to underscore, budget committee, one important purpose that this committee serves is transparency. It's not obviously just us in this, quote unquote room learning and talking and discussing. It's also the broader community that either now or in the future can look back online now at these meetings and review, right? And so I say that in just with this, these several different processes that are surely going to happen around ARP funds, around CSI funding, even around the next maybe infrastructure package that might come out from the federal level, right? All of these different things, we on the one hand have to move expediently and quickly and make decisions efficiently, but on the other hand, there is a purpose to committees like this where we can hash things out in the open and let people track progress, right? And the last thing I want to say, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I already have, there is some talk in this document about how property taxes have fared better than anticipated. And that's great from a city budget perspective, but I want to avoid missing what I think can be a hidden pain in the community. If you look at where our property taxes come from, the demographics that tend to pay the bulk of those, it tends to miss some of the most marginalized communities in the city. And I say that with, obviously due to my background and my work in the community, renters in mind. The eviction moratorium expires in about 2 months from today. That could cause a huge further burden on our systems that may not have been factored in and is certainly not evident in these property tax projections. So things to keep in mind, right? Anyway, I'll close with a thank you and not a doom and gloom. I know this is a huge, weighty document to build, and I really appreciate being able to be here and talk about it.
Thank you. Councillor Keating will be followed by Sean Lundahl.
Thank you, Chair. I also want to echo gratitude for Twyla Miller, City Manager, Manager Maderi, and Vicky Silvers, and the entire E-team for your work and your attention to detail. There are some things that stand out, and since property tax was the latest thing that was just discussed, I will hone in on that for a moment, because the collection is flat starting in fiscal year 2023 for the next 5 years at 95%. I'm wondering where that other 5%, who the other 5% are that aren't paying, and what strategies there are to, 95% is an A, but how do we get to an A plus, and where do we fall in regards to other municipalities? That's where my thinking's at right away. The budget reduction strategies at $4.6 million, roughly half of our target savings account, is alarming, and yet it's not lost that that service or that reduction strategy, while it may reduce services, doesn't necessarily mean it's a reduction in personnel. And I appreciate that. I do have concerns that were mentioned by committee member Jasper about the reduction of service at Station 2. As wildfires rage, climate change worsens, and the Eugene Springfield Fire Team has been called to service both upriver and to battle wildfires in California. I want to be assured that there's not a service reduction for our at Station 2 for the heroes of our community who provide life-saving work daily. Yes, there are opportunities aplenty through the American Rescue Plan. Those are exciting. And around the corner, as alluded to, the potential for transportation jobs, infrastructure package, that's exciting. But also, as committee member Jackson pointed out, and I think we've talked about this a bit at council, and thank you for pointing it out, committee member Jackson, the need for metrics in regards to service delivery for our unhoused population. Add my voice to the choir in that regard. All in all, inspiring first night of our budget committee. Thank you for getting us to the mountaintop, Manager Raderi.
Thank you. Sean will be followed by Councillor Groves.
Thanks for the presentation. No comments from me right now.
Thank you. And Councillor Groves will be followed by myself.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Manager, for the presentation, and budget staff for your work putting into this. Yes, these are difficult times. We've been here before. We will undoubtedly be here again. I know I've seen 3 recessions in my time with the city, and it's never easy. Nevertheless, we need to balance our budget and move forward. I agree with everything I've heard about supporting the budget committee being more involved in the process. Thank you. I applaud the GEMT funding being moved into the ambulance transport fund, which I believe was the intention of the legislature. I do want to express my concern about the reduction of Engine 2 and closing an engine company that responds into some of our most vulnerable population, some of our marginalized community. I want to talk about the importance that this asset plays in the total system. I've worked in this system as a firefighter, as a lead worker, as a supervisor, as a manager, and as an administrator. And I know what this means to the entire system. It will reduce response reliability. We have a pandemic that's still raging. We have unprecedented wildfires being caused by climate change. Removing this asset at a time when we have not kept pace with our staffing levels with the growth of the community gives me great pause. I will be interested in learning more about this. At this point, I'm not, of course, it's not time to be making motions, but it's something I will be looking at closely and trying to find other funding sources. But this is not something to be entered into lightly. Our main responsibility as a city, first and foremost, is protecting the people who live here. We've already had multiple fires in our unhoused population. I know there's a burned out RV sitting on Owen Loop right now. The fire under the Ferry Street Bridge. We've had fires in some of our other camps. I'll stop there, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom either, but thank you for the work thus far.
Thank you. And I also just want to echo the same thank you to staff for the work that's gone into this budget. This is a tough one. We've got so much uncertainty still. A year ago, we knew it made sense that we had all that uncertainty, and I had a lot of hope a year ago that by now things would have really cleared up, and of course they haven't. And so here we are. And I think it's been done really well. I have some frustrations that are about the situation that we're in, but nothing at all other than just glowing remarks about the work that we've done with the hand we've been dealt. As far as that situation evaluation goes, it's hard for me that there are so many ongoing conversations in our community that were touched on through these comments that are kind of stuck on hold outside of the range of where we can talk about them in this budget, because they're still coming forward to council. We've had work sessions on homelessness this month. We'll have work sessions on the community safety initiative and the police policy next month. We don't know what we can do with the ARP funds yet. All of that all rolls up into this list of things that couldn't make it into this budget proposal and slide outside the scope of the work that we're going to be able to do in this committee over the next few weeks. And that is frustrating to have all those conversations happening and not quite being able to dig into them here. But I am heartened at the idea that we will be involved with them when the time is right. And I really appreciate the promise of budget committee involvement in the supplemental, and that eases a lot of that frustration. I can wait as long as we will get to those conversations. So given that, and given the challenges we're facing right now, I'm really happy with the work that's been put in, and I'm very excited to see where we go with this budget. At this time, I am going to offer Mayor Vinnis an opportunity to give remarks as well. But first, I would just like to say, please, if you want a second round, either for additional comments or because you have questions for staff at this time, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll use the same order, virtual hand that is, and I'll use that list of hands to see who to skip through rather than asking each person who doesn't have questions to pass. So, Mayor Vinnis, all you.
Yeah, thank you, Ty, very much. And thank all of you for, staff for this work, and both manager and Twyla for your presentation. I think you're right. This is frustrating because it's a shifting landscape and there's so much that isn't known. What I appreciate about the presentation and about this budget is that it keeps before all of us the sort of key values and priorities that council has been working on year after year. It is a reminder that, the pieces that get held in place this year as key investments, continuing to invest in homelessness, continuing to invest in keeping staffing for climate recovery, keep maintaining that investment in the Human Services Commission, and then looking forward, that list of the priorities FY22 and beyond, recognizing that as we move forward, we're still working on those priorities that are ongoing need to invest in housing and homelessness, in the climate recovery ordinance, and equity, community safety, downtown, library, recreation. Those are all pieces that council has, certainly in my time as mayor, continued to reinforce that those are your priorities. Those are your priority policy areas. They're very well sort of framed in this budget document. And I think that should help us when we're working in a kind of uncertain landscape of having that clear framework. These are the priorities that we've established year after year. So I appreciate the presentation because I think it made that very clear. And I do look forward to this discussion. So thank you very much for giving me a moment to speak.
Thank you, of course. And it looks like we have 4 people with questions. So keeping our same order from the round robin, that would be Eliza, John, Catherine, and Ryan are the hands I see, and we'll go in that order. If anyone else wants a second round, raise your virtual hand and I'll throw you on the end of that queue. So take it away, Eliza.
Okay, so I have my list of more sort of technical questions. To verify the 0.5 FTE for climate recovery ordinance, that's one time, that's a continuation of the previous half a person that we have been funding, correct? That's not like a new half a person. All right. And then was any of the limited duration funding from the climate recovery ordinance implementation that's being removed from this year's budget, is any of that carrying over into this budget? I know sometimes that happens where it's not spent and it kind of rolls over to the next year. For example, I know the $5,000 for the Sustainability Commission grants, I'm under the impression they didn't spend those. Can they spend that next year? Oh. Okay, I'm seeing nods, so I'm just gonna say that's the answer. I am so grateful to see that the gap for the Human Services Commission funding that was caused by the CDBG reductions was just in the budget by default. Thank you. I did want to ask, last year we allocated $73,238 specifically to the Human Services Commission to provide salary increases. And so my question is the amount that we are providing to Human Services this year greater or less, or does the loss of that one-time funding mean that I guess we're telling the service providers to cut salaries? So some clarity as to what that overall funding looks like with that limited duration funding not being included in this year's budget would be helpful. I want to echo that much more information about how we are spending and the outcomes that we're getting for the investments we're making in homelessness and to our in-house community would be greatly appreciated. I'm looking at the numbers in here, and I know there is a huge need not just to address immediate problems, to put Band-Aids on things, but to also really start diving into what are the root causes of this and how do we make systematic shifts? Because if we don't do that, we're just going to be spending all of our money buying Band-Aids and a greater and greater number of Band-Aids every year without actually stopping the bleeding. And so, and when I look at the dollar amount here, that's not even enough for the Band-Aids we need, much less really starting looking at what do we need to do to address this. And then the last question I have, if I can do it in 15 seconds, which I probably can't, I would really like some clarity, particularly for the personnel, if any of these are actually cuts versus not filling vacancies. I noticed some different languages around some of these. So some of them are saying a vacancy and some of them are saying a reduction. And so clarity about which of these things would be harder to, I'll stop and maybe I'll finish in a minute.
Do you, Chair, do you want me to answer the questions if they're short answers now, or do you want all of this to happen in writing?
We have enough time that if there's any short answers that you can give now, I think that would be excellent. And if any of it gets a little more technical and complicated, we can move to writing.
All right, I have two answers. So I know you asked a lot of questions and comments, but there's two that I think I could address right now. And the first one is around the $73,238. That was good detail for the HSC. So that amount was one time. It is not included in here. And the reason it's not included in here is I could not get, unless it came in the last 2 days, when we were building the budget, I could not get confirmation that those dollars actually went to raising salaries. So we asked that specific question, like, hey, these council made a motion to include this money. It was characterized as raising the salaries of social service providers, and that no one could actually confirm it was. And so for that reason, I didn't build it into the budget. And I said, well, if confirmation comes and that actually happened, then I could anticipate somebody might make that motion to sustain that, but I have not been able to get that confirmation. So that's why it's not in there, and we'll continue to look for that. The clarity around the personnel, it tends to be when something says vacancy savings, it's a one-time saving. So the FTE is actually probably still in the budget and we're holding them and we're not filling them. So we're getting the one-time savings. If it has an ongoing personnel reduction, that usually means we're eliminating an FTE. And I'll say this, the city's had a pretty good reputation of trying to get people moved around. We've held positions for the last year. We've been on kind of a hiring pause. So we've been moving people out of positions that we knew were going to be vulnerable in places we needed to save money, like parking, and move them into other places. So if I'm correct, I think we might have one position that actually still has somebody in it that is proposed for elimination at this time.
All right, thank you very much. Councilor Semple, I do see your hand. I've slid you onto the end of this queue. And next, let's hear from John.
Thank you very much. I have a couple questions for Chief Heppel. Chief, while I have some presumptions based on my own experiences, I'd like to hear from you and actually also have the other members of the committee hear directly from you. Has there been a reduction in the fire risk to Eugene that makes it unnecessary to have engine 2?
No, we haven't had a reduction in our fire risk in the city.
All right, well, while it's certainly not an apples to apples comparison, is there something fundamentally different about, say, the South Eugene Hills as compared to the McKenzie River Valley that would prevent us from having a fire just as catastrophic there that we saw last September?
Certainly the potential in the South Hills is there. It's been there for quite a long time. It's been a target hazard for us for years and years and years. Some of the fundamental differences is certainly location and resources. So from a location perspective, the Holiday Farm Fire or up the McKenzie started about 40 plus miles up the river. So just time and resources to get to a fire, to extinguish it while it's in a more smaller or incipient phase is substantially different versus a fire that might start closer to the metropolitan area as a whole, where we provide service delivery, where we have a much larger full-time standing daily force that could get to that fire much quicker while it's much smaller. But certainly there's, depending on where the fire started, the terrain, the weather, temperature, resources that are available at the time, which may not be tied up on other calls, are all variables that would go into how quickly a fire could spread and cause tragedy, for sure.
Sure, and I presume that, however, the greater density of the South Hills, it could also have the potential of being even more catastrophic in loss of life and property. Correct?
It certainly could, absolutely. When you look at population density, but also property values that are in that area as well, per square mile is substantially different in that area. So you're correct, yes.
Is the reduction of the fire apparatus from Station 2, just to make sure, is it a way to right size, for the needs of the community, or is it simply a way to cover a budget shortage? Specifically, if we as the budget committee were able to find the funding, would the citizens of the city of Eugene be safer for it?
So I believe you have two questions in that. And the first one, can you go back? The first part was the fundamental piece.
Well, just, is it, are you right sizing it by making this reduction? Or is this a budget thing?
So to meet our budget needs, we chose to shut down this particular apparatus. To continue with the donut analogy many are using tonight, Station 2 does reside in the donut or the center of the city. It's also a multi-company staff station, so there's more than one fire suppression apparatus there at a time. The other piece is while we have a reduction in service out of that station, it still will continue to be serviced, not only with the remaining apparatus, but with a community response unit, at least 8 hours a day. But it's also much better supported by surrounding stations. So if you could imagine, that's the center of the donut with Station 2 versus if you took the unit away from Station 7, which is our Barger station, that would be like taking a bite out of the donut out on one edge. It wouldn't be as easily covered or as accessible. I
understand. And then also, as we've been having all these discussions about homelessness and the needs, doesn't the homeless population need, or perhaps even need at a higher level, the services that are being provided within your budget? And are we not also affecting the most vulnerable within our community by this reduction?
So again, a multi-layered question. There certainly we see a higher fire risk, usually our and lower socioeconomic status communities. That is not uncommon, and that is clearly documented all the way through the U.S. Fire Administration. In terms of, is it specifically a reduction in service to that community or to the unhoused? I would say not specifically. It's to the community. We impact the community as a whole. We provide emergency services, both fire suppression and hazmat, all hazards, as well as emergency medical services across the city, regardless of geopolitical boundaries. The same as Eugene Springfield Fire, we provide services not to just Eugene, but as well as to Springfield, as well as our 7 contract districts. So our intent is to provide that service delivery very consistently across the system. And again, that's why I elected to utilize the station that was chosen for that reason. This is an effort to maintain as much direct service delivery as possible to the maximum number of our constituents that we deliver service to on a daily basis.
Well, thank you, Chief. I certainly will be making a couple motions in regards. I like the community response unit proposal. I think that's a brilliant way to address some of these needs, but I hate to see that come at the expense of losing fire capacity. I think to stick with this current proposal is just a tragic disregard for the lives, frankly, of the community members. So I will be working on some language on how to try to address that. But thank you for your answers.
Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. I have a couple questions, or I guess requests for additional information that I think are all going to be follow-ups. So I will put them out there. First is on page 77, there's a chart that has general fund. It's just general fund, but it lays out like all the departments, adopted budget, proposed budget, and the change. I'm wondering if there's a way to get that chart, but with all funds included. I know that information is like layered in the back. If it's possible for someone to pull that into just one thing, that would be amazing. And then I think the other request would be, I'm like imagining a flower, sort of like thinking about the community safety, right? Like image. I think it would be really, really helpful to have, I think, at least for homelessness and police, if not the other pieces also, something that I think there's like some of the pieces are in places in the budget document, but not really in a way that kind of pulls together like all of the things that are related to that topic. And particularly the pieces that are kind of baked into the budget, right, that are not being changed, if that makes sense, or things that not live elsewhere, but like sort of that full picture of what each of those things look like. So I would really love if there's a way that we can get kind of a combination of numbers and a little bit of narrative. So it is more detailed than what's in there right now, just to really be able to understand. I think for myself and with conversations I've had with folks in the community, I think it would be great to have that kind of as a tool to be able to clearly say, like in the proposed budget, here is what's happening around homelessness. Like, and it includes the money that has already sort of been in there for the rest stops for the rest of this year, just like all of those pieces. So that's kind of my request. I know it's not a really simple, super duper easy one, but I think it could be a really good tool for helping kind of inform the conversation moving forward. That's all.
Thank you. Sean, I do see you for a second round, and Eliza for a third after that. But next up is Ryan.
Thank you. And I want to super underscore what Catherine just said. It's something I think we've talked about a little in the past. Obviously, homelessness is a priority concern community-wide, right? And complexity is in a lot of ways the opposite of transparency. And right now what we have is a complex means of addressing homelessness in our community. It's spread across multiple departments, right? It would be really helpful, I think, to many people in the community, including myself and Catherine, apparently, if we had to what extent we can do it, sort of a crosswalk or an overlay on different funding streams or services or staff positions that touch on the area of homelessness in some way, right? And so I'm going to try and stick to questions that I think maybe we can answer today. And I know that we have many meetings ahead of us, so I'll be as brief as I can. First, a stupid question, and I'm sorry to have to ask. I could have emailed about it, but I forgot to. On page 15, the second column, I just don't know what some of these codes are. So 0G, 1X.
One time and ongoing.
Oh, duh, of course it's no.
No, it's okay. I tried not to put any acronyms in the presentation, but I ran out of space for this exact reason.
Of course, yeah. Next, I think it's on page 31 is the first place I saw it. Can we get sort of an explanation of what is meant by downtown safety? Like, what's that mean more specifically? Versus, because it's separate from things like downtown ambassadors, I noticed.
Yeah, so this is the downtown station. So the downtown police station that has been funded through parking that we can't fund through parking.
Okay, good. Next. This is probably in there somewhere and I missed it, so I'm sorry. The Portland Loo and the mobile shower, have we implemented that? How's it going?
I don't know if Christy or Matt are here that would want to. There we go, Matt.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We do have the shower trailer in possession, so that has been delivered. And we've been working with, we worked with Lane County, and now we're actually talking with one of the social service providers that runs a number of rest stops about location of that trailer, maybe in a fixed location for a period of time where multiple people from different rest stops or microsites could use it. And then we're still coming up with a deployment plan that would let it be a little bit more mobile. For the Portland Loo, if you're talking about the Portland Loo for the park blocks, I'm not exactly sure what the status of that coming in is. It takes a while for those to get constructed after we order them.
Right, yeah.
We can get you an update on that.
Okay, yeah, and I'm assuming it was just me not seeing it, so I'm sorry.
I can answer that real quick. I think it's been delivered, but we're installing it in the fall.
Okay, very good.
We'll go in the park blocks.
Let's see. In regards to microsites, I know council added several. And again, this is probably in the budget and I didn't see it. How are those funded? The additional sites, are they with ongoing funds or were they one time? For some reason, I had the impression that they ended in December.
The microsites?
The additional microsites that were added, the rest stops.
Yeah, some of the microsites are funded with short-term dollars that will be expiring. And then we have some other resources that we're using as well, some 21 fiscal year 21 COVID general fund dollars and the CARES funding we're used. So,
okay.
But I believe that that we are in a good stable position for what we have planned for fiscal year 22.
Okay. I believe that's all I have for now, and I'll yield back 34 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Zelenka, I do see you for a second round, but now we're going to go to Councilor Semple.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to know what can be funded with the CSI dollars now. I know that times have changed from when we first devised all of that, and we can move the money around within those safety departments, but there may be requests for us to spend it on other things. And I know that we needed voter approval to say we can only spend it on community safety. So I'd like to know the huge list of what community safety includes. And then if we wanted to spend it on something else, would we need to go back to the voters, or would council be able to just write another ordinance? So I know there's going to be a lot of looking at that CSI, so that would help me.
Councilor Simple, I think just FYI, we're having a work session about this on May 10th, and we can clarify a lot of that kind of as we talk to you about what we're hearing from the community.
Okay, that'd be great. I just know it's going to have numbers attached to it. The Portland Loo, why are we waiting until fall? And is this the same, Portland Loo that seemed like we were getting for a while, the same as the money from the urban renewal for the Park Blocks restroom? Are they now one and the same thing?
Yes, they are the one and the same thing. I believe we used some of the first round of federal funds to pay for the actual loo. And I believe it's being not delayed, but installed in coordination with the farmers market project during that construction project in the fall, later in the year.
Okay, thank you. I see that the Spay and Neuter clinic is going down by $77,000, and it's just sort of out there by itself. I'm wondering what the Spay and Neuter clinic budget is and how much this is going to affect them. Seeing as how spaying and neutering for our animals is really, really important. And I wish we could do the rats too. That would be helpful. So I'd like some information about that. The downtown custodian that we're cutting, what does he or she clean? I did not know we had a custodian for downtown.
I'll actually answer both of those questions. So back to the Spay Neuter clinic. Over the course of COVID, the Spay Neuter clinic has not been fully operational and able to perform surgeries through the pandemic because of guidance, lead agency guidance. So they have been operating out of the parking lot, working really hard to continue to sell vaccines and such. The materials and supplies reduction will be manageable next fiscal year because we've achieved some savings this year. So we'll be able to do that. In regard to the facilities custodian position, that position is being eliminated. It's a vacant position that lives in the parking fund, and we're doing our part to reduce costs to the parking fund. That will reduce weekend service to the parking garages.
But not the downtown garbage cans on the sidewalks.
No.
I see that we have an increase of 6.25 new FTEs for in the CSI. I bet people will want to know exactly what those positions are. I don't need to know that right now. And that's it. Well, I'd still like to know about the online budget tool. If it can go any deeper.
Thank you. Next we have Sean's second round.
Thanks. A couple questions. The first one is regarding the fire engine. So it sounds like and even in the budget document, it talks about a service reduction, but that could be a lot of things. Is there a way to quantify that in terms of projected call response time for various types of calls? Or I guess, how is the analysis done on what that will do in terms of outcomes for the reduction in service?
So the reduction in service is simply availability of the unit. Essentially, that unit is a 24/7 unit. So you're going to reduce its availability by 24 hours a day. And then those calls that unit would have picked up would be spread out amongst the other units in the system. So it would increase the utilization or increase the calls that other units are going to respond to. One of the ways we're trying to blunt that is through the implementation of our community response unit, which I talk about pretty extensively around page 40 or 41 in your budget document. And we're bringing that up as a peak time car because we know statistically that our calls, our highest peak time for calls, they start ramping up around 8 or 9 in the morning, and then they start to deteriorate or come down around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And so again, as an effort to blunt that impact on the surrounding units, we're going to add that community response unit to respond to the medical calls that engine would have normally responded to. Why medical calls? Because about 85% of our call volume is medical calls. The other piece is that unit can also focus on our lower acuity calls. So it doesn't have to respond to just within its first due area where Station 2 normally responded. It can also back up our units up the Highway 99 area, as well as in our downtown area as well. So it's simply a function of unit availability, and the fact that a unit isn't there is a reduction in service.
Sure. So I guess outside of the peak call time, when that new unit is not in active status, is there a way of kind of comparing the capacity of the system as it stands now to the projected capacity of the system and kind of figure out on an average day how that might increase response time or whatever the metric is that you would use to kind of compare that?
Yes, we track daily, weekly, monthly call volumes by station. And we'd also do it by day of the week and by time of day. So yes, we have all of those. Those metrics are routinely tracked in our system, and we would see an increase or decrease appropriately in those metrics.
Okay. Yeah, if we could get more detail on that, that would be helpful. I think, in the disaster scenario where we have a huge fire somewhere in or around Eugene, we would probably wish that we had 100 more engines ready to respond, but we have these constraints of a budget that we have to stick within. And so I think understanding what the projected real impact of reducing that engine is, I think would be a useful tool. And then another question about the proposed reductions to the police budget. So on page 117, it talks about these reductions as being one-time reductions. So these are vacancies that will be left vacant for, I presume, the rest of the year and then planned to be filled after that. Is that correct?
So the 1.67 million that we're reducing is considered one time. Originally, we had some ongoing savings built in there, and then it was transitioned to one time. So essentially, we're not losing the FTE or the availability to fill that. We're just choosing to manage our responsibility to meet our budget goals through vacancy savings. So that is one of those opportunities that we can be really dynamic, so we can fill and or hold as the budget allows into the future. But those 11, almost 12 positions are ones that we're going to be holding open. We're actually holding many of those open now in preparation for July 1st of this year. But it's a combination of both professional staff and sworn positions that we'll be holding.
Okay. And so from a budgeting perspective, as we're really trying to solve for an ongoing deficit, not just a one-time deficit, how should we think about a one-time savings from vacancies in terms of how that looks over the next 6-year budget cycle? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's similar to what's a little bit of a different frame of kind of what Catherine was saying, is like, how does a one-time investment actually make a longer term piece? And you're asking kind of the opposite of that, a one-time cut longer term piece. And I think we built all that into the forecast. So it, what happens is we're kind of in a big dip right now. And as we start to grow out of that dip, we need a little bit of time to do that. And it could be that the ARPA funds help with that a little bit too, but we still have some ongoing issues. So I think it helps give us a little bit of time. And I think, as Chris mentioned, I shifted this actually from an ongoing reduction to a one-time reduction because it felt like the council and the community is in such a deep discussion around the CSI and police that it felt like there's going to be some policy decisions made around how our council wants to, allocate those resources. And I felt like for me to go in and say it's 1.7 forever was jumping, kind of jumping the start on that.
And so can I assume then, so the projection truly sees that specific cut as one time?
Yes.
Not, is that right?
All of our one-time reductions and all of our one-time investments and reductions will show up this year, and then they're not there the next year. So the positions are added back if they're a reduction, and the investments aren't there if they're an investment.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep, it does. Yep, that's all I have.
Thank you. Our last second round will be Councilor Zelenka, and then we'll close with Eliza's third.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I wanted to address the comments that John Jasper made. Basically, John, in your comments, you just basically accused the chief of the Eugene Springfield Fire Department of having the intent of harming people or putting them at risk. I've known the chief not that long, but I know his decades of service have been about serving people and protecting people. And so you may disagree, but I don't think you should accuse him of trying to harm people. I found your comments quite offensive, and I may not even agree with what the chief's suggesting here, but I don't think he's trying to kill people. And I think you should be more thoughtful about what you say. So you may want to raise your hand again and clarify what you were saying. Second thing is that a couple of process suggestions. I want to make sure, I think that we have lots of work to do and lots of information to hear back from on the ad hoc committee from police policy and the CSI work that we've done at the surveys, and that's going to all come out over the next month or so. And I don't think this is the time to be doing that. Maybe maybe the city manager can clarify the framework or the process for doing that, so it's a little bit more clear, so we don't end up spending all of our time having motions about CSI here before what I think is before that issue is ripe for discussion. And I think the promise was that the budget committee be included in that process when we do that. So
Thank you, Councilor Zelenka. I actually realized after I finished talking and you guys started talking in your first round, I was like, oh, probably the most important thing I was going to say at the end of my presentation, I forgot to say, which is, my intent tonight was really just to hear kind of feedback and people's thoughts on the budget, because we are in this sort of dynamic, bringing all these different kind of ropes together, that I would come back on May 12th with some ideas about kind of that, like, okay, how do we move forward? I hear some of you may have motions to add. Some of you want to talk about CSI. Some of you want to talk about ARPA, and we can talk about like, okay, how are these things going to come in terms of a timeline? Like council's going to talk about CSI on this date, and just kind of bring some of that back with some ideas about how you might work together as a group to either to inform the council discussions and to inform some of those priorities, and then be back together to talk about the next proposal. Is that may have confused you more, but yes, that's really dynamic. That's why I said it feels like things are going to shift in between meetings, and we'll be kind of touching base again when we see.
So we're designing another process. Budget committee will be involved in that. That's the place to talk about that stuff in that broader context. And
between now and the next meeting, you're going to have had your first meeting on the CSI. So you're meeting about the CSI on the 10th. And that to me is like that football, it's an audible, right? So between Monday and Wednesday, I'll be thinking about, okay, based on how you talked about that Monday, what does that mean for how the budget committee might and where they might intersect? Are you going to say, oh, we heard everything we need to hear and here's how we want to prioritize it? Or will you say, that was really good, we need more information, we need a little bit of time, let's do another work session? So it really depends on how that Monday goes.
Yeah, I can't imagine the first scenario. I can't imagine the second scenario. Yeah, having heard of all of what people have been talking about, I think maybe at the end of this process, when we set the budget, and we have a budget that we're recommending to the council, that might be an appropriate time. There's going to be cuts in that budget. It might be appropriate time to go back and prioritize what cuts should be added back first from ARPA dollars, and being cognizant of our guideline that we use one-time money for one-time expenses, and funding ongoing things with one-time expenses just creates a problem down the road. It really doesn't accomplish what you're trying to do. So maybe at the end of that process, we can have a prioritization of if we had ARPA dollars, how would we add it back? And get that recommendation from the budget committee. I think that would be very helpful to the council. Thank you.
Thank you. I do see Councilor Syret's hand, and that's a second round. So we're going to go to you, Claire, first. And John, I also do see your hand as well. So Councilor Syret, we are starting to get near our scheduled adjournment time. We have a little bit of housekeeping, so just keep that in mind as we work through these last few comments we might have tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So, you know, I just wanted to say I don't want to beat up on John, but I share Alan's critique of how John expressed his concern about the chief's proposal. Framing that proposal as one that will cost lives and that we are choosing to fund other nice things at the expense of people's lives is a pretty strong statement to make. And particularly directing some of that at a fired chief who wakes up every day thinking about how he can keep our community safe. So I also, you know, may support a motion to restore that. So, you know, there is a question there about that, but I think there are other ways to get at making the point that we think this is a priority that should be restored. I just wanted to forecast, since I didn't, since the city manager is kind of listening and taking stock of what we are interested in, I will be having a conversation tomorrow afternoon with our head of public works to talk about, I'd like to add some more resources to our urban forestry program. I think we had a work session on that earlier this year. We all recognize that in terms of our climate recovery goals and even fire defense, you know, our tree canopy can be contributing to that. And I participated in I got to sit in on Active Bethel citizens meeting I think last week, and they had folks from our urban forestry and then Friends of Trees talking about the fact that they have been able to get funding and they are going to be doing quite a bit of planting in Bethel. And I'd love to just make all of that activity more robust. And so you can expect something from me at future meetings on that. Thank you.
Thank you. That will move us into the third round. Hopefully we can keep this relatively quick. I do want to briefly remind everyone that as much as possible, we should try to keep our comments focused on content and not directly about other people. There was a fine line walked, and I think Councilor Syret and Zolega had very valid concerns about the way comments were phrased, but there's a line to walk here, and I want to encourage everyone to maintain as much respect as possible as we work through these proceedings for all of each other. So let's slide into round three with Eliza and then John. And
I want to second that a discussion of prioritization would be very helpful. You know, I'm looking at some of these I see would be hard things to cut and then restore. And so some information, whereas like holding open a vacancy for another 3 months isn't as hard to cut and restore. So I think getting a better sense of, you know, if we're actually laying off a person, a human, that's harder to restore than holding a position vacant for a little bit longer. And I think there are probably other things in this budget, including some of those things that have been talked quite a lot about tonight, that would be harder to restore once we've moved down the road of cutting them. Also, I wanted to get some more clarity about the Human Services Commission funding. When we write contracts, do we typically specify the salaries of the people fulfilling the contracts? I would be surprised if we did. And when we are adjusting salaries for staff, do we expect that to be an ongoing expense, or would we look at that? Would we be comfortable raising staff salaries based on a one-time set of dollars? My understanding of this motion before was that it would help facilitate the subcontractors being able to raise salaries, but that it wouldn't be a direct one-to-one, okay, this exact dollar is going to be spent raising this person's salary. As someone who sets salaries and works in human resources, I don't know how you would do that, particularly since this is only a portion of the funding. You can't exactly say the person who's being paid by the city of Eugene is going to make more than the person who is, being paid with this other contract. And so I would be reluctant to cut that funding based purely on this sort of logistical kind of weirdness, or that level of what that was, if that makes any sense. Or I guess based on kind of what was an unrealistic expectation.
I'm not sure if you're asking me a question or if that was just a comment for the group. Was there a question in that?
I would be curious before we say that we wouldn't further this based on not being able to trace back if it directly translated into raises for staff, if there are any other circumstances where council is saying, we're going to subcontract with you and please pay this person $15.82 an hour or $37.42 an hour, right? If there are other scenarios where we specify salaries for subcontractors.
Yeah, I don't think so. From my perspective, I wasn't looking for specific salary per person. I was looking for confirmation that the policy direction that was part of that motion that was intended to raise the salaries of those employees actually went to some salary raise for employees and not to some other operational need. That's all. That's the level of confirmation, not in a specific dollar amount. We'll keep working on that.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to John.
Thank you. I'd like to apologize to Councilor Sarett and Zoinka and others for not clearly expressing what I was trying to say. I've known Chief Heppel for 15 years. He is one of, if not the most intelligent and most committed to the fire service and people's safety in general that I know. I in no way meant to disparage him or any other individual, city manager or staff, in what I was saying. I was I'm passionate on this, and to the extent that my passion, was not expressed in a productive way, I apologize. My statement was meant to say, as a function of the budget, as an expression of a priority, that we are going on dangerous ground. I have to question, priorities as reflected in the budget, when we propose cuts like this. But I in no way meant to disparage Chief Heppel or anybody else, and I apologize to him and you, Councilor Sarett and Zoinka.
Thank you for saying that, John.
Thank you, John. I do have Councilor Sarett for hopefully a very fast third round.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. That's much appreciated. nicely stated. And I just wanted to speak to Eliza's questions about the HSC allocation. So I think what the city manager is saying is that she has been unable to confirm how that money was used, that we explicitly said would be used to actually help in terms of response to RFPs from social services agencies to increase the amount that might be allocated there so that staff of those social service agencies could have slightly better salaries or a bonus. And she's been unable to confirm that. And I think it's a very legitimate question to ask when we turn over City of Eugene general fund dollars to another agency to expend for us, to know that they were expended in the way that we had directed them to be. So that's the missing information that she's trying to find out.
Thank you, Counselor, and thank you everyone for this wonderful discussion. I believe we have enough time to very quickly get into housekeeping. Your packet did have minutes from the February 18th minute. Did anyone have any recommended changes or comments on those? Seeing none, does anyone have a motion to approve those minutes?
Make a motion to approve as written.
Motion from John, second. I think I just saw Catherine's hand to second.
Mr. Chair?
Councilor Keating, yes.
As someone who wasn't quite yet participating in the budget committee conversations at that time, I'll be abstaining or refraining from voting to pass minutes of a meeting I wasn't at.
Entirely understandable, thank you. So we had a motion by John and a second from Catherine to approve the February 18th minutes. All in favor, please raise your virtual hand so that staff can count. And at a quick glance, I am seeing 12 in favor. And Councilor Keating has already said he plans to abstain. Is anyone else abstaining? I don't see anyone. And is anyone opposed? I don't see anyone, so I believe we've approved those minutes. We do have an announcement before we close, which is our representative to the HSC has been Sean, but his term is expiring. So a call went out to ask who would be interested in taking on that role as our committee's representative. And Mayor Vinnis has appointed Ryan Moore. So congratulations, Ryan. And with that, we can slide into next steps. So where we're going to go from here, we get a 2-week break to process all our thoughts around this and to do any follow-up conversations we want to have with staff. Staff will be getting us answers to some of the questions they weren't able to answer directly tonight. We will then have 3 more meetings on May 12th, 19th, and 26th. Those meetings will include opportunity for public testimony. And from there, that'll give us opportunities to deliberate on the 12th and 19th. And on the 26th, we will have our opportunity to make motions to amend or recommend the budget to council. If you have any additional questions at this point, please email them to Vicky Silvers along with any motions that you intend to make. And on May 12th, at that meeting, we will be having a presentation from staff on the URA 101 and some information about the URA budget. And with that, at 8:00 p.m., this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Stop time.